Chapter 1, The Bouncing Check. February 1991, London, United Kingdom. Robert Maxwell's grip on his empire was loosening in places even he refused to look. In the smoked glass boardrooms of Fleet Street, he moved from chair to chair, barking at editors over stories he no longer read, scrawling his initials on proofs he didn't bother to scan. In the city, he sat at polished conference tables with bankers who nodded politely while their underlings rechecked his collateral. He signed bridge loans routed through Luxembourg shells so thin they could be folded into a single briefcase. The paperwork was clean enough to pass a glance, but never an audit. His treasurer, a pale man with eyes fixed on ledgers, like a man reading weather charts for a storm he could not avoid, muttered about variances that would not reconcile. The numbers were always temporary, and the reconciliations always forthcoming. It was an accounting vocabulary meant to calm shareholders and buy time, but in the private language of finance, it meant the floor was already tilting. Creditors began to go silent. Calls that had once been answered within minutes now lingered in voicemail queues or were returned by assistants. In Tel Aviv, lines that once cut straight to men with diplomatic passports now rang out unanswered. The rare calls from Les in Manhattan were patched through instantly, and Maxwell's voice, hoarse from shouting in other rooms, would drop to a conspiratorial softness. In the corridors of Herzliya, a phrase began to circulate, temporary custodial variance. It sounded harmless, bureaucratic even, but among those who knew the lexicon it was a euphemism with a hard edge. It meant the asset was still in play, but no longer trusted to run the game. It meant the handover had begun. Ghislaine stayed in public view, orbiting charity dinners and art showings with the same poise she had cultivated since Oxford. She posed for photographs, accepted champagne from white-gloved servers, and left events with polite excuses that led not home but to airports. Her travel calendar, visible only to a handful of people, showed discreet flights to Geneva and itineraries marked with opaque references, foundation review, committee briefing. In Herzliya, those entries matched secure visits to the Annex. One of those trips detoured through Rome. In a quiet trattoria near the Tiber, she met a Mossad cultural liaison who didn't bother with pleasantries. Over a plate of pasta gone cold, he told her what no one else would say aloud. "You have a future," he said. He did not need to name her father. She did not ask him to. Meanwhile, in an unremarkable office 2 floors below Herzliya's main operations wing, a junior officer sat at a steel desk drafting an internal succession memo. The language was procedural, the tone dry. It listed operational assets, lines of continuity, and primary contacts for the months ahead. The document would be circulated only to those with clearance to act on it. When the officer reached the final page, he noticed the absence as much as the inclusions. Robert Maxwell's name was nowhere on the list. He didn't add it. He simply closed the file, slid it into a manila envelope, and left it in his outbox for collection. April 1991. The email came through a secure NGO channel, bland in tone, vague in reason. Opportunity for stateside engagement. Cultural exchange emphasis. 3 to 6 months. Ghislaine Maxwell read it twice, then deleted it. She already knew it wasn't a suggestion. In Geneva she played the part well. Officially she was working on cross-cultural literacy initiatives through a Franco-Israeli development consortium. Unofficially, she attended embassy events, donor dinners, and gallery openings that doubled as grooming theatres. Her French was impeccable. Her deference, calibrated. Her reputation in the circles that mattered was that of a woman born for elite access but unburdened by title. Just curious enough to be charming. Just aloof enough to be trusted. But the handlers in Herzliya had grown nervous. Robert Maxwell's volatility was bleeding across borders. Surveillance chatter suggested he had discussed insurance documents during a closed-door meeting in Lisbon. One phrase, captured on tape and relayed through internal dispatch: "If I go down, they all burn." The response from Tel Aviv was prompt: remove the daughter. Reposition the asset. She was told the new post would involve educational partnerships between Ivy League institutions and European philanthropic boards. Something about refugee scholarship funding. A desk had already been arranged inside a Manhattan-based foundation that handled grants to scientific research nonprofits and elite prep schools. The cover was flawless. She accepted without hesitation. She departed Geneva at dusk, 2 days later. Her flat was left intact, her bank accounts untouched. To her social circle she had simply rotated assignments, a diplomatic reshuffling, nothing more. But on the flight to New York, an Israeli intelligence officer 2 rows back sent a short message through a scrambled channel: Maxwell Vector relocated. Proximity to subject G advised. Trial overlap begins. The subject, Jeffrey Epstein, was not yet widely known. His resume was a cipher. A private banker without a license. A math teacher turned multimillionaire with no verifiable IPOs, hedge positions, or audits. But he knew the codes of power, of posture, of appetite. And more importantly, he followed instruction. The call from her father had been as short as it was directionless. Be useful, Maxwell had said, his voice flat, the line disconnecting before she could answer. It was not a request, and it carried no further instruction. She had heard it before, years ago, in context that ranged from charity galas to introductions to men she would later learn not to ask about. The tea room at the Pierre Hotel in Manhattan was crowded but muted, its noise dampened by heavy carpet and gilt-trimmed curtains drawn against the afternoon light. She was shown to a table set for two, white linen folded to regulation. Across from her sat a man she had never met but whose presence had been arranged without discussion. Jeffrey Epstein wore a grey suit cut just short of fashionable, his tie knotted without vanity. He didn't offer a greeting, only leaned forward with the precision of someone rehearsed in compressing time. Surveillance is inheritance, he said, as if answering a question she had not yet asked. Philanthropy is camouflage. Ghislaine let the words settle between them before replying. She tried him first with a line meant to disarm, an arch compliment about his cufflinks, a suggestion that they suited a man who enjoyed being noticed. He didn't smile. Notice is a tool, he said. It cuts both ways. The exchange moved like chess without pieces, each statement a test of comprehension. It was not sexual in the ordinary sense, it was ideological, a quiet weighing of how far the other could be trusted with a system neither would name. The tea cooled in their cups, neither touched the scones. 2 tables over, a society columnist pretended to skim the Herald Tribune, her head tilted just enough to catch fragments. The next week, a blind item would run in her column, socialite meets shadow financier over tea, a pairing to watch. When the check came, Epstein did not offer his name, did not reach for her hand. He simply rose, nodded once, and left. The maitre d' thanked him as if greeting an old friend. Ghislaine noted the exchange. This was a man who either already had the keys, or knew precisely where they were kept. June 1991. The Hotel Beau Rivage in Geneva faced the lake like a diplomat in repose, flawless posture, velvet calm, secrets buried beneath lacquered surfaces. Robert Maxwell arrived under the name Levinson, but no one in the hotel needed to be told who he was. The staff offered him the presidential suite. He declined. Too obvious, he muttered. He took a corner room with no shared walls and installed a private line through which no calls could be traced. Maxwell was heavier now, both in body and in pressure. His linen shirt clung damply to his back. His gait was still commanding, but no longer immune to gravity. The briefcase never left his side. Inside, a sheaf of photocopies, a flash cartridge, and a typed memo bearing the names of 3 Gulf-linked corporations, one of which had been blacklisted by the United Nations just 6 months earlier. He met his contact in a private conference room posing as a business center, though no one had used the room for business in years. The man was French-Algerian ex-DGSE, now working freelance. The money came through a Liechtenstein trust. The accent came from Marseille. The voice recorder was sewn into the lining of his tie. Maxwell didn't waste time. He didn't threaten. He insinuated. These files trace back to a contract signed in Riyadh, under diplomatic fog. The arms came through Haifa. The authorization came from someone whose name cannot appear in a British courtroom. The Algerian nodded, silent. If I fall, Maxwell continued, you won't need a coroner. You'll need a treaty lawyer. There was more. Mentions of logistics run through Cyprus, of Israeli contractors working under false French flags, of deals masked as agricultural aid. And then the real slip, the moment that changed everything. This isn't some Dimona sideshow, Maxwell said. This is bigger. If these go public, it'll make Pollard look like a traffic citation. The man across from him only smiled. The recorder captured every word. When Maxwell finally rose to leave, he sealed the files in a black envelope, marked it hold until payment, and instructed that a copy be forwarded to a bank vault in Luxembourg. If anything happens, he said, they know where to look. But others already knew. 2 days later, an encrypted digital packet was hand-carried from Paris to Herzliya by a courier from the French Embassy's Internal Security Division. The recording was played twice, transcribed once, then destroyed under supervision. A duplicate copy had already been sent to Langley, flagged under a threat matrix reserved for intelligence exposures, involving nuclear thresholds and Allied betrayal. One Mossad handler, reviewing the transcript, scribbled a curt line in the margin, he's bluffing, but he's dangerous. Another underlined the word Dimona 3 times and added, even a bluff can trigger real damage. A meeting was convened before sunrise. The topic was not how to warn Maxwell, it was how to close the loop. August 1991. The London flat was not his, nothing Maxwell occupied anymore truly was. Borrowed from a banker with diminishing patience, the Knightsbridge address had once welcomed foreign dignitaries and newspaper tycoons. Now it stank of cigarette ash and sour coffee. The windows remained shut, the curtains stayed drawn. Maxwell paced like a man who mistook movement for control. He puffed Rothmans to the filter, crushing each stub into a cut glass ashtray overflowing with unresolved gestures. 4 phones cluttered the table. 3 were disconnected. One still worked, and it was the worst of the lot. It gave him hope. He left messages on encrypted lines to Tel Aviv, to Zurich, to an old contact in Geneva who once described him admiringly as an asset with gravity. The man no longer returned calls. That silence echoed louder than any betrayal. Somewhere beneath the lake, in a vault buried beneath kilometers of cable and secrecy, a banker at Credit Suisse opened a new safety deposit box. The man who ordered it never showed his face. The form bore a name the banker had only seen in fleeting dossiers, Jeffrey Epstein. The banker shrugged and scanned the ID. It matched. That was enough. In Herzliya, a handler scanned an intercept log from the Geneva line. The phrase, "Legacy protections requested," appeared in the metadata. The request was denied. The next line was worse, tenant category confirmed. A red mark was drawn beneath the word tenant. Robert Maxwell had always believed himself the architect, now he wasn't. September 1991, Mossad headquarters Herzliya, Israel. The operations wing of Mossad's central compound was buried behind concrete, glass, and sand-blasted deniability. From above, it resembled a data farm. From inside, it felt like a war bunker repurposed by psychiatrists. The walls were soundproofed and pale, the windows did not open, the air smelled faintly of ozone and ink. In a fourth-floor analysis room known simply as a 6, 3 men sat at an oblong table littered with dossiers, surveillance logs, and a secure line phone that hadn't rung in days. On the wall, an LCD panel scrolled live intercepts tagged with codenames, timestamps, and country flags. Most of them scrolled past unread. The subject was Robert Maxwell. A senior officer in a beige sweater vest stood by the screen, holding a laser pointer like a scalpel. "What we're seeing is not a breakdown," he said. "It's strategic decay. He's escalating, calling in favors prematurely, leveraging incomplete files, hinting at retaliation without follow-through. Operationally, this is the behavior of a man who has confused power with position." Another officer, younger, sharper, leaned forward. "He thinks he's untouchable." The room fell quiet. The eldest of the group, a former field liaison whose accent still clung to polished syllables, lit a cigarette and exhaled toward the ceiling. The LCD panel flickered. One of the entries showed a call placed from London to a decommissioned Tel Aviv number. Another listed a meeting request Maxwell had sent to an unmonitored Swiss back channel previously used for coordination with Gulf intermediaries. That line was now dark. A typed memo was passed around the table. It contained a 6-line field evaluation, marked internal eyes only, subject, RM, status, compromised, utility, diminishing, risk, escalating, recommendation, soft phase out, accelerated succession protocol, note, daughter remains viable vector. No one argued. The director entered late. He read the memo in silence, folded it once, and placed it under his palm. "Initiate quiet directive," he said. "Start decoupling. No press, no martyrs." A final note was added to the central archive. "Prepare vault continuity. Daughter assumes peripheral role." October 30, 1991, Canary Islands. The passports were stamped with haste. The itinerary was vague, scattered across 3 travel agents and 2 different embassies. Some assumed Robert Maxwell was fleeing, one final attempt to outrun the mounting liabilities, lawsuits, and silent glares from his own boardroom. Others believed he was simply retreating to familiar waters, indulging his ritual escape aboard the Lady Ghislaine, the yacht named for his favored daughter. He told the press it was a business trip, told his London attorneys to stand by for instructions, told no one exactly where he would be or for how long. The only consistent signal was his growing impatience. He snapped at aides, he packed his own luggage. The briefcases, always 2, never left his sight. The leather one was still sealed tight, the canvas one now bulged with new contents, bound reports from Geneva, an annotated arms ledger, 3 undeclared sat phones. On the tarmac at Heathrow before boarding his Gulfstream 4, he placed a final call to a Tel Aviv number routed through a Luxembourg exchange. The handler on the other end didn't speak. Maxwell left a single sentence: "If the vault opens, it opens for everyone." Maxwell's flight left RAF Northolt under a pre-cleared diplomatic slot, an old courtesy extended by old friends, though none had seen him in months. The Gulfstream's leather interior felt more like a tomb than a retreat. He traveled alone, with only a briefcase, a diplomatic pouch, and a biometric lockbox that remained at his feet the entire time. At altitude, he drank a split of champagne, then switched to scotch. The steward, discreet and silent, avoided eye contact after the second hour. Maxwell stared at the clouds like they owed him something. Somewhere between Cornwall and Lisbon, he muttered into his dictaphone about endgame custodianship, though the recorder wasn't running. On the descent toward Gran Canaria, the sun pierced through the partially open blind in the window. He shielded his eyes and remembered a conversation from years prior, a Mossad handler explaining how sea burials erased everything: trace, motive, closure. Saltwater consumes accountability, the man had said. Maxwell had laughed then. Now the thought made him tighten his grip on the briefcase. As the wheels touched down and the pressurized cabin hissed in relief, he whispered something under his breath, part prayer, part warning. He told himself this trip was a reset, that control could be reasserted. But somewhere deeper, older and closer to truth, he knew, the voyage was not an escape. It was a summons. When the jet touched down in Tenerife, the sky was heavy with salt and cloud. A black car met him on the runway and delivered him to the marina, where the Lady Ghislaine waited, polished and quiet. The crew stood at attention. A few recognized the tension in his shoulders. They'd seen it before, during the BCCI scandal, during the pension buyback schemes. But this was different. He wasn't angry, he was hollow. He boarded without ceremony, took no questions, and ordered the engines readied. Before the sun set, the yacht pulled away from port and cut east into deeper waters. Back on board, Maxwell walked the deck barefoot. He began muttering names again, this time to no one in particular. He imagined the sea listening, storing each syllable in its brine archive. The yacht felt smaller now, like it had pulled in around him. Its teak floors, once polished for guests, now held the dust of too many solitary days. He still had files. Or said he did. Promise logs, transfer records, things he claimed would reorder the story of the past decade. If true, they were worth empires. If false, they were worth even more, as bluff. The Lady Ghislaine drifted off Gran Canaria, its hull cutting black water, anchored still. The sea was calm, conspiratorial, no wind, only tide against fiberglass. Robert Maxwell paced the upper deck, silk robe over crimson pajamas, slippers thudding on teak. The £440 million pension theft haunted him, inquiries tightening, Wexner's unanswered call a silent betrayal. He clutched a yellowed letter, arms through Yugoslavia, Vatican-Iran accounts, names marked Jericho. His fingers shook. The crew, trimmed to 7, moved quietly. 2 bodyguards, loyal but uneasy, watched him. The ship's logs listed no destination. Maxwell's sat phone rig, a cumbersome Inmarsat, crackled uselessly. He muttered into a dead dictaphone, "I have the cables. They think I won't use them." The brandy glass reflected distant lights, a heartbeat refusing to quit. In Herzliya, a handler logged his calls, 6 to Geneva, BCCI echoes from June 1991. A memo read, "Tenant category confirmed." Maxwell was no longer an architect, but a tenant. In the master cabin, he picked up the phone and dialed one last number. It rang again, then it clicked, not to a voice, but to silence. He stayed on the line for a full minute, holding it like a pulse. Eventually, even the static gave up. November 1991, Maxwell stood at the bow, sweat plastering his shirt. The yacht felt small, its teak warped, brass tarnished. He dialed Ghislaine. 8 rings, no answer. The static died. He whispered to the sea, "They don't want what I still have." Below, his briefcase held Unit 8200 watermarks, King David hotel notes, signed receipts, enough to detonate empires. Or so he believed. By the time the Lady Ghislaine slipped past the outer buoys off Tenerife, the main deck of the Lady Ghislaine had been cleared of guests and decor, refitted with a satellite phone terminal jury-rigged to 2 backup power relays. For 2 nights straight, Maxwell had paced the upper deck in his robe, brandy in hand, making encrypted calls routed through maritime relays. Ship logs show each call lasted under 3 minutes. The crew had been trimmed to skeleton strength, just 7 men, most of them hand-picked and recently rotated in. 2 personal bodyguards remained from Maxwell's usual retinue, but even they looked unsure of their orders. The ship's logs were deliberately vague. No declared destination, no public itinerary. When questioned by port authorities, Maxwell's chief steward shrugged and said only, "He's chasing warm weather." But Maxwell wasn't chasing anything, he was buying time. The sun hung low over Las Palmas, casting long orange lines across the marina, as if measuring time in shadows. Robert Maxwell stood at the bow of the Lady Ghislaine, his silk shirt plastered to his back with sweat and tension. The teak beneath his bare feet was already warping under the salt-heavy air, and the yacht's polished brass trim did little to disguise the wear in its captain. He had been pacing since dawn. On deck, the crew worked quietly, with a rhythm that betrayed no concern, only familiarity with a man whose volatility had become a weather system of its own. They had learned that silence brought survival. Below, in the forward hold, Maxwell's purser secured the last of the dry goods and signed off on a manifest that had been doctored before it ever touched his hands. A second envelope, unsealed, bore only the word weather in block script, and inside, an abbreviated list of refit logs, a diesel fuel chit, and a contact number written in a different hand, European, maybe Swiss. In the narrow provisioning office just off the harbour, the mechanic tapped a red marker next to radio fault, a note that hadn't existed during the yacht's last inspection. He said nothing. No one asked. The static hadn't stopped since the Herzliya handlers had adjusted the uplink. Maxwell was unraveling. He no longer took his calls in private, barking half-coherent phrases into satellite phones about London algorithms, Swiss delays, and legacy permissions, denied. He'd placed 6 calls in the last 48 hours to the same number in Geneva. It had once belonged to a man who called him an asset with gravity. It now rang unanswered. That evening, after the yacht's engines were run and shuttered again, Maxwell walked barefoot to the upper deck, holding a miniature dictaphone that had stopped recording hours ago. He spoke into it anyway. "I have the names. I have the cables. They think I won't use them," he muttered. "Let them test it." He pressed the rewind button, but the machine made no sound, just a soft whir of internal failure, like a secret trying not to be remembered. Maxwell poured himself a scotch and held it to his lips. He didn't drink. Just watched the reflection wobble in the glass. Across the water, distant lights traced the coastline like a heartbeat refusing to quit. He picked up the phone one more time and dialed his daughter. The line rang 8 times, no answer. It clicked, soft and dead. Maxwell didn't try again. He returned to the deck, looked out at the black ocean, and whispered to no one in particular, "They don't want to hear what I still have." The Mar-a-Lago ballroom pulsed with bass-heavy music, the air thick with expensive perfume, salty ocean breeze from open French doors, and the faint musk of anticipation. George Rainey, a Florida promoter with a perpetual tan and fraying nerves, had delivered 28 women in their early 20s, bronzed skin glowing under chandeliers, bodies poured into skimpy bikinis and sheer wraps that left little to the imagination, like a living calendar shoot. They moved on the dance floor, hips swaying in synchronized temptation, laughter light but eyes calculating, knowing this gig paid triple for special entertainment. The guest list was exclusive to 2 men, both reveling in the private spectacle. Donald Trump prowled the room like a king surveying his domain, suit jacket discarded, shirt unbuttoned to reveal a gold chain nestled in chest hair, pointing at the women with proprietary glee. "That one," he said, jabbing a finger at a blonde with curves straining her bikini top, her breasts heaving with each breath. "Prime material, Jeff. Look at those, firm, ready for the spotlight." Jeffrey Epstein leaned in close, his laugh a low rumble, breath hot against Trump's ear as he whispered back, eyes devouring the scene. "Indeed, Don, but watch this brunette ass like a ripe peach begging to be bitten." Their banter flowed, crude and intimate, hands brushing as they gestured, the air between them charged with shared hunger. A discreet NBC cameraman captured it all from the shadows, lens panning slowly across the writhing bodies, zooming on Trump's finger tracing the air toward a redhead, whose thong rode high, her cheeks flushing as she arched her back in response. Epstein doubled over in laughter at Trump's next quip. "Needs a little work on the top, but the bottom? Gold?" The frame freezing their complicity for tapes that would surface decades later. The women danced closer, pretending the music drowned their awareness. Champagne flutes passed but mostly ignored, bubbles fizzing like the tension. One bold brunette pressed against Trump, her oiled skin sliding along his arm, nipples hard against the thin fabric as she whispered an offer. Epstein watched, adjusting himself discreetly, his arousal evident in the tightening of his pants. Trump pulled Epstein aside to a velvet couch, the women circling like sirens, one kneeling to refill their glasses, her cleavage spilling forward as she bent low. "This is the life, Jeff," Trump said, hand grazing a thigh. "Power, pussy, no rules." Epstein's eyes gleamed, fingers tracing a model's hip and insulation. "No consequences." Rainey watched from the edge, his role as impresario turning sour, realizing he'd staged not pleasure but leverage, a tableau of indulgence binding the men in mutual secrets, bodies the currency of their rising empire. The night deepened, music fading to moans in private suites, the ballroom emptying as pairs slipped away. Trump and Epstein shared a final toast, the women's touches lingering, the syndicate's early web spinning in the haze of lust and control. 2,000 miles away in Herzliya, the night unfolded under fluorescent lights in the operations suite, the air conditioned to a precise chill, servers humming like a distant hive. A technician sat at his console, the Palm Beach feed streaming in raw, high-definition bursts from the NBC cameraman's discreet lens. He logged the segment number, cross-tagging it with Trump's casino holdings in Atlantic City and Epstein's aviation assets, the Lolita Express routes already mapped in prior entries. The data populated a new folder, Vector, Entertainment, Politics, Eastern Seaboard. He paused the playback on a frame of Trump pointing, Epstein laughing, the women's bodies a blur of bronzed skin and calculated poses, and added a note, high-value bonding event, monitor for escalation. Another analyst, a woman with sharp features and a stack of printouts from Langley Intercepts, highlighted the timing in the file metadata. May 1992, an election year with Bush's approval tanking after the LA riots and Clinton surging in primaries. She scrawled in the digital margin, potential bipartisan capture. The women's names came from Irani's handwritten list, faxed earlier that day, typed in one by one, anonymized to codes. WB01, white blonde, 5 feet 8 inches, prior pageant, BR14, brunette, 5 feet 6 inches, modeling scout referral. Height, hair color, prior work, all reduced to intake markers, cross-referenced with visa records and flight manifests. Not one of them would be forgotten. Even if the night itself faded into rumor, the vault's memory was eternal. Over in the corner of the room, a handler leaned against a filing cabinet, arms crossed, watching the feed loop. He's building bridges, he muttered to no one in particular, not just with money, but with appetite. Trump thinks it's play, Epstein's collection, but this ties them. Nobody contradicted him. The conclusion was already obvious in the room's quiet nods. Trump might see the evening as spectacle, Epstein as a personal gallery, but for Herzliya it was another kind of architecture, blackmail as mortar, opportunity as beam, the vault growing beam by beam. If Trump ascended to higher office, it was leverage. If he collapsed in scandal, it was still leverage. The tapes are switched to flip at the right moment. The technician pulled up related files. Trump's 1980s tower sales to shadowy buyers, Epstein's Little St. James guest logs overlapping with Mar-a-Lago events. The analyst added a flag, election cycle vulnerability. Prep for 96 cycle if Bush falls. The handler pushed off the cabinet, circling the console. O'Reilly's list is gold. Recruit 1, flip the rest. The women are the weak link, but controllable. He pointed at the screen, frozen on a brunette pressing against Trump. Start with her. Background check, family ties, debts. The room shifted to action, keyboards clacking, the feed sharded to secure nodes, the party's debauchery digitized into power. For Herzliya, the night was not about what happened in the ballroom, but about what could be made to matter later. Nothing was ever just a party, it was data, a node in the web, the syndicate's patience game where indulgence built chains. The curator reviewed the upload, the annexes screens reflecting in his glasses. Assets bonded. Leverage established. Initiate long-term track.